You got a slightly different angle tonight, Mike.
Oh, do I?
Like a little bit. I mean, you don't have to change it. I was just like, oh, it looks like a little bit different of an angle.
Yeah, you're down a little bit.
Yeah, it's probably got moved without me knowing. And I need to fix the fact that the video looks like a wreck because my house is currently a wreck. uh,
It's excusable. You have kids.
well, I have kids, and we're moving. My wife's parents are moving in with her grandfather,
Ooh.
so they're downsizing their house to basically fit into the other. So I've got a bunch of stuff that just came in from their house that they don't need anymore.
Yeah.
And last summer we did the same thing for my mom when she downsized from a house to a townhouse. So it's getting very cozy.
Okay, I got the Reddit social done. I've got the Twitter social finished. Pin to profile. No, don't pin to profile. I want you to add some flair. That's what I want. I want some flair added to this. There we go. Reddit flair. All right. Let's see here. You guys are ready for this? Part 4.
No,
Part
this is the toughest
4.
one.
That's right.
You guys ready for this?
Fantasy forwards. Uh-oh, I could hear me in someone's speaker.
Oh, that was me.
What's going on over there?
I didn't mute it fast enough.
How dare you?
Bush League. Clearly, that's
Yeah,
all
I
it
know.
is. Bush League. Okay, well. Well, if you guys are ready, then I'll go ahead and get this intro going.
Right.
Let's see, let me get that brought up so I can get this thing right first. Videos. Live. Yep, there we go. Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the MLS Fantasy Insider Podcast, our week 13 suspension episode. Holy cow. This episode is brought to you by The Wonderful World of Disney. Hey, they own Star Wars and Marvel. Might as well get ready for them to buy MLS next. Actually, no. Brought to you by MLSFantasyBoss.com and the amazing Patreon community of the MLS Fantasy Insider. You guys are awesome. Thanks for sticking with us during this strange time. This is all for you, so thanks so much for being members of this amazing community. I'm your host, Reed Connolly from MLSFantasyBoss.com, and tonight I'm joined by my usual partners in fantasy, Blaine Riffle and Michael Denton. How are you guys doing?
I'm good.
I, for one, welcome our mouse overlords.
This is part 4. If you have been listening to us for the past few weeks, this is part 4 of our best MLS Fantasy 11 team of all time. And there's a little caveat after that. We are looking at the modern game, which we define, there is some debate, but we define as 2012 through today, 2020. For these stats, if you go back through the archive, we don't have 2012 stats for everybody, but again, tonight we're going to be talking about forwards. I have been able to get some stats related to goal scoring that should give us a rough idea of who we could imagine would be in the top 10, 20 players from that year. So we'll be able to include that in some of our discussion tonight, as we were with goalkeepers a few weeks ago when we were able to look at shutouts for that. So but yeah, that's our plan. We're going through the forwards tonight. Gonna be a tough one. These have gotten tougher and tougher each week because we can only pick 3 forwards at the end of tonight's discussion because we're following MLS Fantasy roster rules here. And they are strict. Boy, are they strict. So it's gonna be I hope, entertaining for you all to listen to how we whittle down our picks from top 10 down to 3, which may or may not include a bench player next week whenever we release our final drafts of our best 11s, plus the various best 11s according to the numbers of fantasy. So it should be kind of fun when we wrap everything up next week and see how that falls in place. So, guys, we will just go right into it unless you have something else you want to add before we go on. No? All right. Well, here we go. So, as we've done for the past few weeks, I'm going to ask Blaine and Mike to give me their top 10 players, as well as just any other players they want to mention, or just sort of their general thought process for coming to their top 10. We will then whittle it down, an easy whittle, down to top 8. We're going to whittle it down to top 5 just for funsies this time, but then settle it down with knocking off two more for our top 3 forwards. So we're going to make those cuts deep and hard, and that's going to be pretty fun. So Blaine, let's start with you. Your top 10 forwards and your general thought process and players you want to mention.
Yeah, getting 10 was a little difficult with the way I like to do these. I've gone through this whole list with longevity in mind, but maybe before I do my 10, we'll all weigh in here. Forward is one of those positions where longevity isn't really a thing in this league. I really feel like forwards is where we could break this era up into 2 or 3 different waves. You had the guys that started in 2012 through about 2014 that really carried this league, and that was about the time that guys like Giovinco came in, and then you had Giovinco and Villa and Martinez all come in, and every time a new forward was bought, they kind of jump to the top of the forwards list, which makes it really, really hard to quantify some of these guys because you've got a lot of one-hit wonders or 2 to 3 good years, and then they get replaced by somebody. And it gets really tough to stack these guys up. So I've gone for longevity, and that's how I kind of filled in the back end of my list. But this thing is so heavily weighted towards recency bias that it was kind of tough. And I don't know if you guys had those same problems when you were filling out yours.
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know if I'd necessarily say the forwards don't last long. I mean, there have been definitely some marquee forwards that were in the league for several years, performed at a high point. And then lots of guys who probably stayed in that top 10 to 20 discussion that popped around. So I guess it just depends if you're talking more about top 10 forwards or what. But I think I have a decent mix of the years represented with my list, but I can see how it was hard. I did try to think to myself, is a player who's only been here for 2 years, the last 2 years, enough to make the list? So I tried to think broader beyond that into general fantasy impact.
Yeah, so I'll get to my 10 now, and I'm just doing them in as close to alphabetical order as I can get them. I do know my alphabet, everybody. I just, with certain names and how you do it, sometimes you get them out of order because of how you list them. Bradley Wright-Phillips is my number 1 because I put him in on my list as BWP, and when you sort at BWP, always is going to fly to the top. So he's my first guy on the list here. And then I went with Dwyer Giovinco, of course. Kai Kamara makes my list here. He's one of those guys that's been in the league for a long time, and one of the tiebreakers on that back end was just number of years of service for him. Robbie Keane, Joseph Martinez, Jordan Morris, Carlos Vela, David Villa, and then I had to put Chris Wondolowski on there. All-time leading goal scorer in MLS, and he's done so much in the leagues for fantasy throughout this period. It's hard to leave him off a list like this.
BWP, Dom, Gio, Keane, J Mart, Morris, Vela, Villa, Wando, and I think I missed one.
Kai Kamara.
Just keeping a little list right here for myself of everybody's picks. Mike, what about you?
Well, unsurprisingly, my list begins and really ends with the greatest forward of all time, Patrick Mullins. I don't know why we even had more of a conversation.
No surprise you have him. Yes.
um, uh, so in actuality, my list, it's not really in alphabetical order. I'm just going to jumble it up. I have Jozy Altidore, David Villa, Bradley Wright-Phillips, Joseph Martinez, Carlos Vela, Robbie Keane, Sebastian Giovinco, Chris Wondolowski, Didier Drogba, and Zlatan. And there's a few names I put on there because their longevity is just too great to be ignored. But for the most part, I was looking at guys who were dominant at their position at the times that they were playing. A lot of forwards, they tend to move around a little bit.
Sure.
And good forwards tend to move on so quickly, or they tend to come in the tail end of their careers, like David Villa. So essentially, these guys, when they were playing for fantasy, I was looking for their matchups and them to have good matchups to fill out my forward spot. So that's kind of the first thing that I went into in making this list.
I like some of the variety that we're seeing so far. I have a little bit of overlap with each of you guys, a couple of different names as well. But I want to start with some players who I don't know if will get mentioned tonight. So first one is going to be Federico Higuain. And Higuain was one of those players that started out as a forward, moved over to midfielder. And I think last week we decided that he was best considered a midfielder, correct?
Yeah,
That's where I
think
list him as.
I agree. He was in the top 10 forwards for 3 of the years that we're talking about here. In 2013, he was the number 1 scoring forward, thanks to his assists, I will put right there. And then he was in the top 10 in 14 and 15. But even those top 10 finishes, his points were below what comparable midfielders were putting up. So, but he's a name I wanted to throw out there who is a long time in the league and I think was often a go-to fantasy person, but did not make my list as well. I think that was also due to some of the other players available at Columbus during those times. I'm going to throw in 2 names that I don't think made any of our lists, but I definitely want to, or definitely didn't make any of our lists, but I want to throw out there just because of the history on there. And that's with the Bash brothers, Alan Gordon, Stephen Lenhart. So much super subs right there. I think many fantasy players picked up these guys as just a long shot. They were usually cheap. They represent sort of the super subs. And sometimes they were just a Hail Mary of, well, I'll put this guy here. Maybe I can get a switcheroo in, or maybe this is just someone who I have to use to fill a spot. But just want to mention those guys. A name that's not on our lists, and I think this may be some recency bias that ends up not panning out. Like, I guess just you think he's better, and that's Albert Ellis. And I know he's really hot. We always had those trouble, though, with Houston of which forwards to pick. Yeah. And Elise was usually the go-to one, but when you go back and start looking at the stats, he's not ever a top 10 fantasy forward. Manotas cracks that into that top 10, but no, Elise never did for us, always wanting to go there, and I think that's just, again, that shows the hardships of multiple forwards really cutting into the fantasy points, and why someone you may not hear them on the list. I have to give a shout out to our man Quincy Merrick. He big supporter of the show and has actually been in the top 20 a few times. He was 12th overall in fantasy in 2014, and then he was 20th overall in 2015. So Quincy is no one to take lightly. He has put up some good fantasy numbers over the years, but unfortunately he did tend to become more of a super sub at times, and so his fantasy production dropped off. I'm going to talk about Adi real quick. I know he was real popular for 2 years in 15 and 16, and then just nothing. And what's interesting for me is all of us have names on our list of players who had solid 2-year runs. Adi's came in the middle of the season, and one thing I tried to think about when I was making decisions was, what was the longevity of that player, or what is that player remembered? And so when I think Adi, even though he was a top 10 forward for 2 years, I think people more remember some of the failures afterwards than necessarily the successes. And just he was never high up in the top 10s either. So didn't make my cut. I don't know if you guys had those same thoughts when you were looking at forwards. And then I also want to talk about David Accam. He was on these lists a couple of times, and he was even a top 10 forward in 2017. But I think that consistency, like you mentioned, Blaine, so many of these forwards, like I'm looking at Plata, and I'm looking at Villalba, and I'm looking at Urruti, and I'm looking at who else do we have here? Balas Perez. I mean, so many of these names are older guys or younger guys, and they pop up for once. And as I probably said every week, I look through this list and I think, man, I remember thinking this person is hot. This is the guy I want. And then I look back at these stats now that I have them all out in front of me. I'm like, no.
Oh,
not so much.
It's a change in the way MLS is run, because two of the names that kind of popped up in my early draft were Eric Torres and Kyle Larin.
Yeah.
And both of those guys, as younger players, had the really good price point, and they just tore it up for their price point. And then all of a sudden, like, Larin got sold, which was obvious, and I guess Torres got sold and then came back, and he hadn't done anything since he came back.
No.
If he had a better return to the league, he could definitely be in this top 10 list with the way he started.
Torres was 11th in 2014, and then Kyle Larin was 10th in 2015 and 8th in 2016. So even those performances fairly average as far as fantasy forwards go.
And we haven't even mentioned names like Clint Dempsey or Wayne Rooney as guys who I remember being, would get hot, but they wouldn't. Clint Dempsey had injury issues for the period that we're talking about, and his U.S. men's national team duties would always detract from his fantasy abilities. And then Wayne Rooney was just here not long enough to register too much on our list. But
I mean, and then two names that I know probably won't come up, that guys that have shown a lot of promise. Ola Kamara was flirting with my list. He was in one of those first guys out. Had some really good runs around for us and put up some decent numbers, but he left in the middle and then came back, and he hasn't done enough with DC to make my list. But one of those guys that, if we carry on for another 5 years, could definitely work his way up into one of these conversations for longevity. And then the other guy that, if we were looking at a smaller sample size, is Obafemi Martins. I mean, just absolutely tore it up with Seattle and had that really, really strong run. But again, left the league so quick that even with some better names coming in behind him, probably could have kept the longevity tag going and made this list if he had stuck with MLS.
Yeah, top 10 player in 14 and 15, third overall in 14, and then number 9 in 15. So even for what we talk about, didn't make the list consistently. And I think even more so, I know as Matt Doyle likes to point out on Extra Time, tended to fail during playoffs. So no love right there. So Dempsey, you mentioned Dempsey, Mike. That's a name that just shocks me that hasn't been on any of our lists, because there's just so much you think of Clint Dempsey. You're thinking of MLS. You're thinking. I mean, he also has his times at Fulham. He also has his times at Tottenham and everything. But there's these strong MLS connections with Clint Dempsey, and then you just start looking at the fantasy numbers, and you're like, and he was bad. Oh, so that was great. So I'm going to mention my top 10 now, and then we may talk about a few more. But any other names you guys want to throw out before we move on to our first cut, let me know. No particular order as well. These first few lists: Wondolowski, Vela, Villa, Martinez, Joseph Martinez, Kai Kamara. I got him on overlap there. Robbie Keane, Sebastian Giovinco. A unique name for me, Will Bruin. Maybe no surprise for me, but Mike, unlike you, I did stick with my player there. Bradley Wright-Phillips and Zlatan. I threw that in there. I will go ahead and explain my Will Bruin pick. Did not come into this being like, I'm going to pick Will Bruin because he's like my favorite forward who just never actually does fantastic in fantasy. Because I started looking at these numbers, and he's got 4 years of being in the top 20 of fantasy and 2 years of being in the top 10 with fantasy, and that's with him moving around some as well. So when I got down, I mean, Will Bruin, I'll just give you a spoiler right now. It's not going to make my first cut. but when I start looking around here and I'm seeing so many forwards who are in a top 10 and then just completely disappear, or are in a top 10, maybe drop down to a top 20 and then just completely disappear. Will Bruin had 4 solid years of, and I'm throwing in 2012 into this. He scored 12 goals in 2012. I think that would have been enough to make him maybe a top 10 player, but at least a top 15 player, I believe, going on those goal totals. But I mean, Will Bruin had 4 solid years of performance during this era of fantasy. And when I'm looking at some of the other options of who was maybe a 9th or a 10th player on my list, I just feel like that's a production, and that's production for a player who was usually affordable that you could throw in, and was oftentimes a good backup if somebody else was injured, that made him worth adding to my list. Blaine, I want you to talk about Dom, because you had Dom Dwyer and Mike and I did not. He is on the stats list. He's on there 3 times, twice in the top 10 and once in the top 15.
Yeah, and that's really where it comes down to. As I was looking at some kind of longevity here, guys that got 3 good years in were hard to ignore.
Okay.
And then there's kind of this transition in the early part of this era where Robbie Keane was here and tearing it up and one of the best names you could get. And then you had Bradley Wright-Phillips come into the league. And, I mean, he set all sorts of goal-scoring records for number of goals in a 3-year span and stuff like that. I know he won the Golden Boot and pushed the number up higher than it's ever been before. Right in Bradley Wright-Phillips' shadow was Dom Dwyer through that whole thing. And I think if we didn't have BWP to look at, everybody would be remembering Dwyer as one of the best fantasy forwards of that era. And it's that early part, I think it was 14, 15, 16 for Dwyer with Kansas City when those hit. And he's not going to make my first cut. I'll spoil that here. But he was just right there in BWP's shadow, and I played a lot of draft. And, I mean, he was your number 2, number 3 forward behind BWP, and depending on who else was in the league at the time, some guys didn't want to take a risk on Dwyer. But, I mean, he was a top 3 pick those years, and one of those guys that just was always there. And anytime somebody gets a record $1.6 million transfer fee inside MLS, he must have been doing something right to command that type of money on a sale.
I don't know if I agree with that.
I don't think I did either. Did you say he was a Golden Boot winner?
No.
Okay,
No,
I was going to say Dom Dwyer was
BWP
not a Golden Boot winner.
No, BWP broke all the records and stole all the accolades, but Dwyer was right there in his shadow. I think he had second most goals over that 3-year span when Bradley Wright-Phillips set the record for most goals in a 3-year span.
Yeah, BWP is a 2-time Golden Boot winner.
Yeah, and no doubt BWP gets on there, but Dwyer was kind of in his shadow the whole time, and I think he gets lost in a lot of lists because of that. But his run over those 3 years was incredible. That's where the $1.6 million transfer fee comes in. He was that good, and they wanted their hometown guy back, or the guy who came through their club, and that's why he went to Orlando. And Dwyer, if he would have continued his career the way he started it, who knows where he would end up on this list. But he tailed off so hard in Orlando that's why he gets out. He's gone at the first cut.
Yeah, and I think that's why he doesn't make it for me. Is he made the top 10 twice, was in a top 20 as well in that 3-year period, then went to Orlando. They dropped the money for that hometown kid, and then disappeared. So I have trouble adding him on the list when after he made that big move back, he hasn't done. I mean, we had Laren as well, who was doing some stuff at that time, but for me it dropped off. If we're talking about players with 3 good years, I mean, what about Thierry Henry?
How did nobody mention him?
I'm mentioning him now. I'm saving some stuff. I'm bringing it out organically. Thierry Henry. Again, this is a 2012 player, but top 10 these first 3 years of our bracket. Has a great meme, and then retired. So I don't know. That's fair though. I can see why you would go for for someone like Dom Dwyer. Mike, let's go get one from you. Drogba. That was a guy on my list of players I didn't think we'd talk about that I wanted to at least mention, but he's on your top 10.
Yeah, I mean it's mostly the dominance. When the year he came in, 11 games, 11 goals, and an assist, and then a goal every 2 games. The second year, he was just very hot. I think he was also generally pretty good for bonus points. And didn't look that up, but he usually would get a number of shots, and be a strong contributor. And with Piatti, that was a strong nucleus while it lasted. So I don't have Drogba very high on my list, but I think Drogba is up there. I think the other one that I had on my list that none of y'all had was Jozy Altidore.
Yes.
I don't think any of y'all had it. Jozy, I think, gets hurt because of U.S. Men's national teams games, which hurts his overall stats. But generally, he's good for a goal every other game, and he was always a good pairing with someone else, especially a pairing with Giovinco. And I think that hurts him overall as far as the next conversation. But I mean, 11 goals in 2019, 15 in 2017. He got hurt in 18, but 10, 13 since 15. So you've got 4 years of double-digit goals in there. A healthy number of assists, 7, 6, and 5 for his healthy years. So I trying to fill out the end of the list. I could see you swapping with Kai Kamara, but yeah, I mean, with as dominant as Toronto was, and as much as you wanted Toronto fantasy players, I just couldn't leave Jozy off the list.
Fun fact about Jozy Altidore, he was in the top 23 years during this time period. I think you're spot on with the U.S. men's national team impacting his performance. Never a top 10 player, but in 15 and 17, David Accam finished above him both years. So probably a cheaper player at that time for sure, but I just thought that was interesting that we mentioned Altidore, and then like, oh yeah, that's why I added Accam specifically, is I knew someone would mention Altidore and I wanted to throw that stat out. 2019 definitely not the same situation, but Jozy was literally 20th, so a lot of guys above him right there. Then Blaine, the final one that you have, we'll cover all the unique ones, is you mentioned Morris.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about Seattle with Dempsey, and then Obafemi Martins came up. Morris wasn't playing at that point. Mike, kind of like you, I went with kind of that second tier guy. We always want Giovinco if we were taking Toronto. Altidore was kind of that bonus. Jordan Morris has always been kind of that second tier player on his own team behind somebody else. You're either looking at Ladero or you're looking at Dempsey, but Morris's numbers have always been pretty solid for that. And this was more of a price point pick for my list, as well as just solid numbers. He always seemed to be undervalued up until these last couple of years, and gave you pretty decent production for his price point. And just one of those guys. I wanted somebody. I thought about Jozy at this spot, but there's just been a few guys that have stood out as kind of that second guy you would think of, and Morris has always been kind of the value option second guy that I've gravitated towards. And I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but I do think his numbers back him up, at least as a second tier guy. Maybe not your Mike saying no, but
no, because I looked at Jordan Morris, and then when I looked at the stats, I was like, oh, I thought he was better. He essentially, Jordan Morris's resume is like 2 decent years, and then 1 really, really bad year. Because in 2016, he's got 32 games started and 12 goals, 4 assists. That's not too bad. But 2017, 22 games started and 3 goals with only 1 assist. And then 2018, he was gone,
injured,
for injury the entire year. I think that was his ACL year.
Yeah.
Then now he bounced back in 2019 for 10 goals in 24 games, with 7 assists. But I mean, even at that point, he was still competing with Rui Diaz for, the top billing. I do agree with Blaine that he's always been an interesting secondary option, but there was one year where he was absolute no-go.
Sophomore slump right there.
Yeah.
Top 10 player in 2016, and then that's the only appearance on the list. Last player I do want to mention before we move on, CJ Sepang had a really good interview on Extra Time in their last episode. Not on our list, but he is also a player who has been represented in a top 24 times during this time period. Again, a little bit of question going back to 2012. He's one of several players who scored 9 goals, so I think that probably would have gotten him in the top 20, but he's been a top 10 player in 17 and 19. So CJ Sepang, another guy I at least want to give a shout out to before we move on.
Yeah, I love Sepang. I just didn't feel like he had the resume to back it up. But
No, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, one of those just fun all around players. I got to meet him at one point,
Cool.
and just really, really good guy. Just really threw everything he had at the game, and still does. Could have been dominant, but I feel like he's always been kind of behind somebody else who's gotten the start over him, or he's been pushed out wide or something. It's just, I think he's one of those guys. He couldn't quite make it as your premier number 10 or number 9, and then he's gotten pushed around the field, and he's still doing a lot of good work pushed around the field. Honestly, probably better than Jozy Altidore getting pushed out wide, being a true center forward. Just made that transition a lot better, but he suffers because he hasn't been able to play his more natural position the whole time. One of those guys I would love to see him higher on the list, but just didn't quite do it.
Zardes, another player who is on this list 4 times, but 3 of them are below the top 10. Only 1 top 10 appearance. So, okay, moving on. First cut. Gonna make a first cut, guys. I need you to cut 2 players from your list. Take me from a top 8 down to a top 10. No particular order. So, Blaine, which 2 players do you cut?
Yeah, I already teased it with Dwyer being cut at this point. He was always the number 2 guy behind Bradley Wright-Phillips. Great run at a point where we didn't have as many forward options. They were a lot more hit and miss. He just seemed to be one of the more consistent guys in an era where things were a little bleaker, at least as I remember him. And then Jordan Morris, the resume just isn't there to beat out any of these other guys on the list. Loved giving a shout out to him to get the inclusion here, but definitely not a top 8 caliber at this point.
You gave yourself an easy cut. You did that on purpose.
Maybe a little.
You dirty dog, Mike.
I'll cut the 2 that you mentioned that I had alone on my list. I'll cut Jozy Altidore and Didier Drogba. I just don't think they have quite as high as heights as these other players, either in terms of longevity or how bright their star burned when it was in the sky.
Okay, I left myself 1 easy cut. I'll take that. My first cut is Will Bruin. He had some good finishes, but it's mostly been a secondary player, sub, and not finishing as high in the top 10s. Second cut, and Blaine leaves. Blaine leaves right before this. If you're not watching this on YouTube, guys, you missed some fun stuff. You missed backgrounds. You missed Blaine just being like, forget this.
Miss me handing my wife a bag of trash 2 minutes ago?
Just handing my trash, Blaine just disappearing. It's ridiculous. But so I'll tell this again to Blaine when he comes back. But the second cut for me. Welcome back, Blaine. The second cut for me, so hard. I ended up cutting Kai Kamara in my first round, and this was so tough because Kai Kamara is in our top 20 6 times. He is on here 6 times. Has huge history with this league. One of those times, he is the number 1 forward in the game. 2015, 203 points right there. 6 again. He had 11 goals in 2012. I'm thinking that would have got him in the top 10 at least, or maybe right there on the cusp. But I cut Kai Kamara because he had that one great year in 2015, and then after that, his next 4 appearances in the top 20. He doesn't make the top 10. He's only in the top 20, and they just get lower and lower each time. So he ended up being a player that you often hoped for more out of than ended up producing for you in fantasy. And so the player that ended up making my cut, that I really was coming down between was actually Bradley Wright-Phillips. I was really thinking hard between Kai Kamara and Bradley Wright-Phillips, and BWP's on this list 5 times solidly, not going back to 2012, and in every year except 2015 when Kai Kamara was the number 1 player, BWP finished higher in the rankings than Kai Kamara. So I ended up cutting Kai, and that was hard. That was so hard. General reactions you guys want to make before we move on to the next cut?
Who's Blaine's second cut? I forgot to write down.
Dwyer and Morris.
Okay.
Yes, Dwyer Morris. You guys, you left your easy cuts, you guys. Okay, but you're gonna have to take it up now. Now you got your 8. I'm gonna ask you to cut it in half. Tell me who your top, not half. We'll let you just cut off 3. Give me your top 5 forwards now. So cut off 3 more. Who do you have?
So,
or just tell me who you cut. Which 3 are you going to cut? Leave me with your top 5, and then we'll do our rankings from there to get down to our top 3.
So I'm really glad to cut these 3 together. These are 3 of my longevity picks that made the list. All 3 guys have been consistent, solid, long-term options, and these were guys you could count on in the early stages of fantasy. When we start talking 2012, 2013, these were the guys that were putting up the numbers before teams were really buying heavy into foreign forwards, bringing in big names that were going to come light up the scoreboard, and it became kind of an arms race to see who could get the best one bought in each year. And that's BWP, Wondolowski, and Kai Kamara. They all get cut here. Reed, you ran the numbers great on Kamara and BWP. 6 and 5 in the top 20 for those guys. Kamara, even though he took a year out, was one of those dominant forces early on, and then he's slowly fallen down the rankings. And I think some of that comes down to age, and some of that comes down to other teams are buying in just better forwards than Kamara is. No slight on him. It's the way the league is going. It's the way young attackers are being brought in. Guys like Kamara and Wondolowski, even though they're still really productive later in their career, it's not enough to make the top 20 anymore. I know Wondolowski, 10 straight years of 10 goals? Something like that. Incredible run for him. And I mean, Wondolowski and Kamara are number 1 and number 2 in MLS goal scoring all time.
Wondolowski is in the top 20 for 7 of our 8 years right here.
Yeah. I mean, just incredible runs by all 3 of these guys. Pretty consistent. They may not be the guys that light up the score sheet every week, but they're going to get you good points when you grab them. BWP actually probably being the weakest of those. I remember him being a 2-7 type of player. He either gets you 2 points or he gets you the goal and gets you 7. And that's why I'm not putting these guys in any order. I have good memories of all 3 of them in fantasy. Good numbers. BWP hit more than he missed. You could suffer through a couple of 2s because he'd get you 4 or 5 5s in that same time frame. Just 3 guys that really carried the forward position through some down years in fantasy when we weren't looking at all these big names. I mean, I call them down years. When you get to the top 5, you've got some really heavy hitters, and we've got a lot of recency bias here. Like, I couldn't imagine going back to the core of forwards we had from 2012 to about 2015 and trying to pick and play the game, because we're so spoiled with who we have right now and who we've had really for the last 5 years.
It's tough. All right, those are okay. I think. All right, that's okay, Mike. I think you got again. You had yourself some easy cuts right there. It's not really getting hard for you, Mike.
Okay, let's maybe we can start cutting to the chase.
Let's make this hurt. Let's make this hurt.
There's a group of 4 that we haven't talked about, and it's really easy up until that point. I mean, so really the question is who gets that 5th spot in this one. So okay, so we all know who the group of four is. Everyone who listens to the podcast probably knows who the group of four is, because everyone who responded to the tweet on Twitter and in like when we asked, like gave the same group of four whenever we asked for four. So, all right. So these are the four people that I'm trying to decide between cutting to make this a little bit more entertaining. I'm deciding between Wando, David Villa, BWP, and Zlatan.
But you only have to cut three.
I have to cut three out of these.
Yeah,
three out of these.
It's his list. Yeah, I like this. Let's do it.
These are my list of. These are the four people I'm trying to determine who to cut. Zlatan to me is an easy cut there because Zlatan is wildly inconsistent. Yeah, he was awesome. He did amazing stuff, but like he would disappear, and you got it too. And it was hard to tell sometimes if the other team had a defensive scheme against crossing, Zlatan was out. So love Zlatan, but I don't think he can go much higher. He was the first one to cut. Wando has done great consistency, but he's never really been one of the top players. He's never a must-have fantasy guy, except for like way back whenever he had the Golden Boot year, which I guess was 2012, so right on the cusp of the era that we're talking about. But for the most part, Wondolowski has been a solid option. If San Jose had a double game week, you would look at him. But otherwise, he's not one of the guys, oh gosh, I need to have Chris Wondolowski on my team. So he's cut. So then I'm left with David Villa and Bradley Wright-Phillips. And if you think I'm going to put Bradley Wright-Phillips above David Villa in anything, you don't know me. No, I'm putting David Villa into my top five. My reasoning is this. David Villa was unique in how many shots he would absolutely get. So he was absolutely one of the best consistency players because even if he didn't get a goal or assist, he was going to get you 4, maybe 5 points just in accumulating all those shots. It's a close competition. Bradley Wright-Phillips obviously has some heights, had a Golden Boot season. There were times where you definitely wanted Bradley Wright-Phillips, but David Villa was the best forward, one of the best forwards, and one of the best forwards over 4 years. So he's one of the few players who does have that longevity. So that's why I put David Villa over Bradley Wright-Phillips, but that is a tougher call. And if I didn't have glasses of sky blue, maybe I'd make a different call, but there's no way I'm going to put Bradley Wright-Phillips over Villa.
Mike, that wasn't just to back you up, Mike, that wasn't even a question for me.
Okay.
My top 10 has Villa, and I haven't cut him yet, so that wasn't even a question for me. So I'm with you. You're not just sky blue glasses there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just pick up from right there. My first player who I cut, which I guess I teased a little bit last time when I was talking about my decisions, is Bradley Wright-Phillips. He was right there on that cusp when I was thinking of Kai Kamara and BWP, and so he just didn't have that longevity to continue forward. Most of it being that he had those good years, but then he started to drop off, and now he's really more of a frustration, I think, for fantasy managers, and so he hasn't had that consistency carry forward. So definitely worth in the top 10. But if I'm cutting down to a top 5 here, BWP does drop off. After that, it's again for me. These were just agonizing picks. I'm just shocked at how easily you guys can just go through them, which is probably good for podcasting. But these were agonizing picks, and my next cut is Zlatan. And this is the way I look at it. It was tough for me because he had 2 great years. And it's the same 2 great years that Vela had. It's the same 2 great years that Martinez had. So he had 2 great years. And these are other names that everyone listening already knows is going to be in our final conversation. So why not Zlatan? And for me, when I thought about this, and I'm looking at these stats of all these players, thinking about what's happened to me as a player of the fantasy game, and what these players have meant to me and how I strategize, there are players on this list with history. There are players on this list with a future. Zlatan is a blip. That's what it is. Zlatan was a blip in the game. He was great for the league, great for interest, but as far as fantasy goes, Zlatan was a blip. And so that made it easier for me to cut him at this point, even though he's right up there with some of the conversations with other players that we'll mention later. That leaves my final cut for this group, and this one was hard. This one was so hard. But like you guys, I ended up going with Chris Wondolowski, and it was how could I cut this guy who was literally almost a top 20 player every year during the fantasy season that we're looking at, Fantasy 3.0. Almost every year he was a top 20 player. How could I cut this guy? And it just comes down to, even though he is there and he's a top 10 player 4 times during this period, there were other players who we've already mentioned and will mention soon who were more consistently in higher positions during a shorter period of time and have just meant so much to this league when you're thinking of the stereotype or the archetype for what kind of forward do you want? What kind of forward am I looking for when it comes to fantasy? Wando is a poacher, and that worked great in the past, but he's not been able to get as great a production going forward. He's had more competition going forward. He's had more time splitting going forward as well. And so it was so hard because as much as Wando is ingrained in the history of MLS, he is equally ingrained in the history of fantasy as a player you're going to look at, but he just became that player of, I don't know who I want. Wando's a good bet. So I had to cut him at this point, and it was so tough.
He became the cheap option.
He did. He really did.
Yeah.
You know, the cheap side option, which, is great in fantasy. He definitely had his utility. But, I remember last year we were talking about him as a switcheroo candidate. And, obviously he's at the tail end of his career, San Jose and all that. But it is tough to put someone in your all-time best top 5 if he's a switcheroo candidate. The names we're going to be talking about are absolute must-starts. Guys who you're like, you've got to captain this guy almost every week.
All right. Now,
and I feel like before we get there, I have to defend my pick because you guys both cut Zlatan right here, and I didn't even have him in my top 10.
That's a good point, Blaine. What were you thinking?
I'm one of those guys. I'm thinking, did I miss something here? Maybe I should have replaced Dwyer or Morris with Zlatan.
Yes.
Maybe I should have. Yeah.
He still scored a goal from midfield, so he just did what David Villa had already done. But yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I feel like I missed one here, and maybe I did. But I also was thinking about Zlatan when I wrote this up, and I go, I don't know. I feel like MLS is going to be a footnote in Zlatan's career, but Zlatan is just going to be kind of one of those passing mentions in MLS history when it comes down to it. When I think of my top 5, I can't really compare him to my second 5, but when I think about my top 5, every single guy in the top 5 is one of those names that is just going to go down in MLS legend. These are guys that came here, did something really, really good, and kind of went out on top or went out with good graces. The way Zlatan left and with the way everything went down, I just don't see him being a big part of MLS history once it all gets said and done.
Sure.
And that's where my other 5 came in. I was like, let's go to the early era. I was like, I could throw another 2-year wonder in there, another one of those guys who came in, really tore it up, and left really quick. And I put him up there kind of with Kyle Larin at that point. Larin had 2 good years as a lot younger player and an MLS product. But I was just like, let's give some of these other guys some love that came here and did it for either longer or, Jordan Morris is just one of those U.S. fanboy things too. But that's probably the spot Zlatan should have. And that was probably a mistake on my part. But the rest of the guys did a lot for MLS for a longer period of time. And even then, Morris is just a good feel-good story for MLS coming up in the league and staying at home instead of going overseas and doing that. So that's why I can cut Zlatan, and I don't feel bad about it because Zlatan. MLS is a footnote in his career. If he had won MLS Cup, maybe my opinion would change because he would have made history here, but he was always number 2 behind Vela and really never – did he even win a playoff game?
I don't recall, but
I don't think he did.
If he had won an MLS Cup based on the team that LA had at that time, he would have won it by himself. So
yeah.
He would have been the reason, so don't at me.
Oh, no, he did win. They won the first round, and then they went to the LAFC derby where they lost.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
There we go.
He did win one.
A blip. He is a blip. Okay, Now it's the actual tough time. So I'm gonna ask you first to give me your top. So we've got our top five. Sorry, we have our top five. So
And it's
read
unanimous, isn't
read
it?
to me your top five, and then we'll go through and I'll ask you to rank them 1 through 5, thus giving us your. You know what? Let's have some more fun with it. I'll ask you for your 1 and 2, and then I want you to dialogue out your number 3 for how you end up cutting 2 more guys here. So, yeah, I think it's pretty safe. Our unanimous top 5 here in no order. We have Sebastian Giovinco, which I'll go ahead and mention for Giovinco. In 2015, he was listed as a midfielder, but I think all of us agree clearly that he is a forward. And in 2015, he had 251 points as a midfielder. That was when Kai Kamara was the number 1 forward with 203. So pretty sure he would have had that number 1 spot at that point in 2015 had he been marked as such. But Sebastian Giovinco we also have Joseph Martinez on this list. We also have old man Robbie Keane on this list. Mike's favorite David Villa makes this list, and also Carlos Vela makes our list. So our unanimous top 5 right there is how we're going into this. So Blaine, I'm going to start with you. Give me your number 1, your number 2, and then let's have that discussion for how you pick the number 3.
Number 1 and number 2, like, I agonized over this a little bit. I shouldn't have. It's pretty obvious. These are the guys that when they came in and they changed the face of the game. They changed the way we played the game. They kind of changed how we looked at that position a little bit. And that's number 1 is Carlos Vela and number 2 is Sebastian Giovinco. And I could see these guys being easily reversed. Vela's got all the fantasy numbers. Giovinco did it for a little bit longer. Vela's probably going to surpass Giovinco in every statistical category for fantasy scoring by the time this is over. And that's why I gave Vela the number 1. If he plays 3 more years, I think there will be no question that he was better than Giovinco for fantasy. But only having the smaller sample size, I could see how somebody would flip-flop those. But those 2 guys, when they joined the league, they became instant must-owns, instant hits in fantasy. They almost single-handedly won draft leagues that I was playing in. Like, having these guys on your team was that important in the draft league that if you got lucky enough and knew to draft them, you came out on top. If they happened to fall to you because somebody ahead of you didn't draft them, you came out on top. Like, it was just these guys broke the system to a degree. And then number 3, I mean, now you're looking at Martinez, Keane, and Villa. That is so tough. I don't want to make a call here. All 3 of these guys, I think I know my order that I want to do it in. And I think I'm going to go with like just importance to the game at the time they were playing. I have to give it to Robbie Keane for my number 3. I'm going to give the old guy the shout out here. Again, I talk about kind of the older time in fantasy where I look at forwards as being a little bit more of a bleak option. Robbie Keane was rising to the top. We didn't have this wealth of riches up top and some guys spread out over the price spectrum that you could grab that would reasonably score decent points. You had a few elite guys, and then you have the rest of the pack. And Robbie Keane really did lead that group of elite guys in the early part of this fantasy era. And yes, he retired early, or he got out of MLS before some of these other names came in, and I don't think he would compete with some of these other names. It was a different era, and I think he was one of those original DP must-have forwards. I have fond memories of him. I had him in my draft league, I think the year I won the league. He was one of those guys that I was always after in the draft league while he was here. His average was up there. He was just a good player on a good team, consistent points, and really was doing it at a time when you had fewer options, which propels him higher up my list because he was one of the only go-to guys you had at the position, rather than what we have today where there's been 4, 5, 6 names in a good week that you could look at. Back then you only had a few names, and Keane was always one of those few names.
So you are cutting David Villa and Joseph Martinez?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Cutting David Villa and Joseph Martinez. Blaine's top three: Vela, Gio, and Keane. All right. Mike?
All right. So the first cut, I mean, I mentioned or alluded earlier to a group of four. I don't think David Villa is in that group of four. I think it's Giovinco, Martinez, Vela, and Keane, like we've talked about. So, I mean, David Villa has been tremendous, but I mean, during all that time that he was playing, I think he was always the second best option at most. One of these other stars were usually up in there, surpassing him a little bit. So then I was kind of wrestling with these four, and it really depends on which standard you bring to bear.
Okay.
If you're looking for total consistency, like this guy's going to get an assist, Joseph Martinez tends to lose that because Joseph Martinez is not an assist guy. If you're looking for longevity, Carlos Vela kind of loses that. He's only been 2 years. If you're looking, for just sheer number of stats, Robbie Keane loses that. One guy who I couldn't really think of he loses in a category is Sebastian Giovinco. And to me, he was the first one who just absolutely, and I remember Guy Sanchez's rant, to this day, he broke the game. He broke MLS fantasy. And I couldn't find a way to get him anything other than number one because of that. He was the complete package in terms of high number of assists, high number of goals. It's possible that Carlos Vela, if he maintains the pace that he showed, could surpass it. But Giovinco has done that for 4 years. It's hard for me to do anything else than to award him number one here. So that leaves me with the tough call of who to not put in the top three out of those three. I tend to value assists. That said, Joseph Martinez is a goal a game, which is just so much better than Robbie Keane. And really, when I think of forwards, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a guy who, when I know he's going to have a good matchup, he's going to get a goal. And Joseph Martinez, usually he doesn't just get you a goal. Usually gets you a hattie or a brace. Usually it's huge captain points. To the point where, I mean, if they were playing today, I would never pick Robbie Keane over Joseph Martinez. And Joseph Martinez has done this now for 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. Unfortunately, he's hurt this year, so we don't know what it'll be. We'll never get to see this year for him, obviously. But it's just hard for me to put that down. So then it's between Carlos Vela and Robbie Keane. And obviously, it's really a determination of the longevity of the longevity of Robbie Keane, who has been dominant since the beginning of this year, the beginning of this era, because he signed in 2011. So his really time to shine is 2012 to 2015. So I think out of those 3 years, Robbie Keane is the best forward or one of the best. But always Captain Vela was a height that Robbie Keane never got to. Robbie Keane, even during the time of limited transfers, you would have him in, but you'd have to transfer him out because of international breaks. Carlos Vela hasn't had to deal with that in MLS. Obviously, it's a different era with the unlimited transfers. And it's just too much. 34 goals? Yeah, 34 goals, 15 assists. That's just so much above and beyond what Robbie Keane did. I know Robbie Keane dominated that era, but to me, it feels like we would just be giving him a gift just based on that era, as opposed to looking forward. There's just too much of a gap between what Robbie Keane did and what these other three for me to put him in there. He was an amazing forward. He was the top forward for that time. But since this era includes this dominant era with these three forwards, I just can't put him in myself. So my top three is 1 Giovinco, 2 Joseph Martinez, 3 Carlos Vela, and then Robbie Keane and David Villa to finish it off.
All right. Good. Okay, for myself, I thought that we would all have a unanimous number one. So this is good. I like some of the variety here. For me, the number one player that I have is Carlos Vela. And that is because of always Captain Vela. That is because of how he's just come in and been such a dominant force these last couple of years. He is a forward that we're looking to going forward as well. He's just a banner for this position in fantasy and what we hope it does for us as players. So for me, that makes Carlos Vela my number one pick. I agree with Blaine. Number two, with that being said about Carlos Vela just coming in and getting things done, I can't ignore the raw production over the past few years, or the past couple of years, of Joseph Martinez. Again, another one of those players where when you're setting your team week in, week out, you're pretty much automatically throwing him in and then thinking if that's a good pick. It's like I want to have Vela, I want to have Martinez. These might be just the only two players I run with, and then I'll just make the budget work for everybody else. They're both types of players that you're almost willing to sacrifice other places on your team for. And so for me, again, the unfortunate injury. I saw a picture of him rehabilitating before we came on, started the show. So glad to see that's on the mend. But so for me, Joseph Martinez takes the second spot. I agree with Mike right there. That put it down to David Villa, Sebastian Giovinco, and Robbie Keane for me. And this is where I got started to get tough. I agree with both of you guys. At this point, David Villa left my list because of the top four players I was looking at. All of them during their time were essentially must-haves. I wanted to have this player. They were the guy I wanted to have to be able to captain. Like this is what I wanted to have. David Villa was never that player. He was, as Mike said, he was always a number two that you'd want to have, or I would find out if Mike had Villa, and then I would get him if Mike didn't, because that's how his scoring worked. Sure. But David Villa was a fantastic player, second overall, first overall in 15, 16, and 17. A fantastic fantasy option. Rarely were there guys who were better, but it's just been so overshadowed by Vela and Martinez that at this point I did have to cut Villa just because of what other players meant in connection. So that leaves me with Robbie Keane and Sebastian Giovinco. And the interesting part for me is I had a same thought pattern as Mike, and is I was looking at how I like to pick forwards, and oftentimes it is a forward who can do more than just score goals. For me, someone who can get assists is almost a more valuable forward because they have another outlet for points if they're not getting the goals. And it was so hard because Giovinco means so much to this league, and Robbie Keane has such an amazing pedigree, but I ended up going with Robbie Keane as number 3 just because he was so much, and he was doing those things Gio was doing. He had the must-have status day in and day out for the limited transfers team, where you'd almost be willing to keep him even knowing he wasn't necessarily gonna do much because you wanted to have that in your budget. He was making great scores. When Gio had bigger dips at times than Keane did when he wasn't doing well, but very similar with how the points go. But for me, ultimately it came down to he was a must-have forward that if he wasn't going to score the goals, I still had a great shot at getting a solid point production from him based on other bonus points. And he was also the first player I ever had who got me a captain and a hat trick. So that meant a lot. But yeah, so my top 3 ended up being Carlos Vela, Joseph Martinez, and then Robbie Keane in a very tough decision. And then I ended up dropping David Villa and Sebastian Giovinco. I don't think that the points will play out to support me in this overall, because I think Gio's scores based on the point inflation at that time will probably be some difference. But I do think that Robbie Keane super important.
See, now I have to defend my. You guys both put Martinez at number 2, and I've got him at my number 4, and I feel like I have to.
Yeah, kind of surprised. I'll be honest.
Yeah,
you really screwed this one up, Blaine.
Yeah. No, I'm one of those crazy players. No, I'm a draft player. That's the other thing. Is I've got the draft side of it going too, and I have to look at. I was listening to you guys talk. I was listening to everything, and I go, Martinez joined the league, and nobody knew quite what he was going to do. So you drafted him early when he was available, and you moved on. But I think everybody in our leagues drafted somebody else higher than Martinez, unless they were an Atlanta person. Like, you went with a more proven forward before Martinez, but if he was still there in the first round and all the other forwards were gone, you took him. Like, that's the way I remember the draft going down. But I look at these other three names that I put above him with Vela, Giovinco, and Keane. These were the guys to draft when they were playing. And each one got replaced at a certain point by one of these other guys on the list. I mean, I don't remember whether Keane dropped off before BWP really came on. I mean, he would be the fourth guy that's in the must-own transition. Like, you go Keane to possibly BWP being right there to Giovinco to Vela. Martinez never cracks that list of, like, overall consensus number one in my draft leagues. Yes, he's way up there. He's always number two. But if you had a chance at Giovinco, you took Giovinco. If you had a chance at Vela, you took Vela. Like, you never thought twice about taking Martinez over one of these two guys. And so that's where those two guys get in. And then that leaves Keane kind of as the outlier in his own era. And then I go back to my draft league again, and I go, if I miss out on Martinez, I mean, that's assuming Giovinco's gone. I've got Villa. I've got a couple other names that I like right there. Yes, I'm losing some production, but I don't feel like I'm getting the drop off the cliff like I did with Keane and then everybody else. Like, Keane was just that much better, except for maybe BWP at that time. He was just that much better than the rest of the competition. You felt like you were dropping off a cliff if you didn't get him. And so that's kind of how I did it. Martinez, totally a top three candidate if you didn't have these other names in this era. Production-wise, I mean, arguably number one overall if we're looking at just production-wise. I mean, maybe Vela's got him, maybe not. I mean, a goal a game is outstanding. But just the drop-off from your number one guy to your number two guy has been steeper with, I would say, Vela, Giovinco, and Keane than it ever was with Martinez. And we've got that 1 year of Martinez being the new guy to the league that lit things up before anybody really knew what to expect. Thankfully, in MLS Fantasy, we can react to that on the fly and start grabbing that guy as soon as we see, oh, hey, look, he's a goal-a-game type of player. Maybe I just need to start grabbing him, and I lose a little bit of budget increase, but at least I've got him, and I can get him just like everybody else does. In the draft league, it wasn't that way, and so that's kind of how I differentiated these guys.
Using the draft league in the fantasy MLS reasonings. Okay.
Well, my question is, what was your draft league doing in 2018? Because Joseph Martinez scored 19 goals in 20 games in 2017. And so in 2018, they should have been aware that Joseph Martinez was pretty good. they should have been knowing. Because that was the year that he broke the single season record. But
somebody knew what they were doing and took Vela number one overall. I mean, Vela went before.
Not that year. They shouldn't have taken Vela number one.
That's true.
I mean, 2018,
they missed that on 23 points.
Because in 2019, I understand Vela over Joseph Martinez because Joseph Martinez had just lost Almiron. We didn't know how much that was going to impact him. And, Carlos Vela had those great stats. And I think LAFC just got stronger. It's the second season for an expansion team. Mm-hmm. But part of that was, we just saw Joseph Martinez and look what he did in the second season. He scored 31 goals in 34 games. Maybe that could be Carlos Vela. But I mean, like in 2018, the draft guy should have been like, I want Joseph Martinez. I mean, he should. I mean, if he wasn't first off the board, it was only because Almiron went first.
Yeah.
I'm trying to look it up here really quick. I've got access to some of my draft. You said 2018. Let me see if I can find it.
Well, you think, because I'm going to start wrapping up, and that can be your final comment. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this discussion about forwards. It was very tough. maybe tougher for me than these other guys. But it was a very tough conversation, but a lot of fun. Next week, we're going to be breaking this down to just the numbers. Our opinions are off the table. I'm going to be looking at points per 90. I'm going to be looking at points per game. And of course, I'm going to be looking at total points overall. If there's another category you'd like me to look into, send me a message on Twitter at MLS Fantasy Boss. Let me know at MLSFI, either one, and I will see if I can add that into the list of best 11s that we talk about at that time. I am going to try to see if I can cobble together some kind of stats for 2012 so we can include those in, but if I can't, unlike these past discussions, I will not just include goalkeepers and forward numbers for coming up with these totals. So I will drop 2012 if I have to give everybody an even playing field. So it may just be 13 through 2019. I also won't include 2020 because it's not over yet and all the craziness that's going on. So that's the plan for next week, and I hope you guys tune in because it's going to be fantastic either on YouTube or on SoundCloud. So that's what I have to say. Final comments from you guys. Blaine.
I found them all 3 drafts in our pool league, in our tiered league for 2018. In our top flight league, Joseph Martinez actually fell to me at number 6, ahead of him in 2018. So you got to get that. That's before Vela. That was Vela's first year. Vela went number 11 overall out of 10 teams. So he went all the way to the second round. Martinez was behind David Villa, Giovinco, Ladero, Alessandrini, and Valeri. The other 2 leagues, one of them had him going in the second round at pick 16. So he was behind a whole lot of names. I don't necessarily trust that league. That was an interesting group of guys drafting there, and when he fell past 6, he should have gone. Fun laugh. I have to do this. I can't pass it up. In 2018, Skylar Redpath drafted at the 6th spot and the 15th spot. He took Nico Ladero at number 6. He took David Akam at number 15, and that was immediately followed by Martinez at 16. So Skylar took Akam over Martinez.
He did finish 7 in 2017, so he did finish above Martinez. All right, Mike, final comments.
Just that this was, getting that 4 down to the 3, I pretty much changed my answer like 20 times today. So, it was a tough one.
It was rough. All right, thank you so much for everyone. Again, we'll be back next week to finish this up, and then with hope there'll be some more information about the Orlando tournament, so we will know what fantasy may be available at that time. So thank you much, and good luck.